This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
A few months back, I did a video where I tried to reproduce my own version of a famous portrait of Ernest Hemingway shot by photographer Yusuf Karsh. And I asked you in the comment section to let me know if you're enjoying these kinds of videos and if you'd like to see more of them. And because so many of you did, we're back today for another one. In case you missed that last video, the idea for these videos came from a blog that I used to read years ago called Guess the Lighting by photographer Ted Sabarese, where he took famous magazine covers or celebrity portraits and used to create lighting diagrams to try and reverse engineer and guess how those images were lit and captured. And I thought this idea of learning how to see the lighting in an image is an important skill for any photographer to learn. You've probably seen the image that we're going to be attempting to replicate today in the thumbnail, but before we get to taking a closer look at that, I want to thank our model for today, Alona. I met her recently. She came out to one of the Meaning in the Making talks and we got to chatting, and she kindly agreed to come along today and sit as a model for this image. She has a fascinating career, but I'm not going to ruin it for you. I'm going to leave her Instagram down in the description below. Go along and check her out. So let's start by diving in and taking a closer look at this image to see if we can work out what's going on with the lighting.
So the image that we're going to try and emulate this time is this famous portrait of Michelle Pfeiffer, which was taken by celebrity photographer Terry O'Neill in about 1990. And one of the reasons I wanted to attempt this portrait is because, again, like the last one, it's not at all my style of lighting. This is a very traditional style of beauty lighting, and it might look deceptively simple to pull off, but it actually takes a lot of control. And I think it's a lighting style that everyone should attempt and teach themselves at some stage if they're serious in portraits. So let's start by working out what our key light is. And if we take a look at the catch light in the eyes, we can see a distinctive donut catch light at the top of the eyes, which tells us that this is a beauty dish. I'm going to guess because it's quite a specular harsh light that it was probably a silver beauty dish, and it's placed quite low in the frame because that catch light is quite low in the eye. You can almost see the whole of the beauty dish. Normally I place a beauty dish quite high, but in this case it's placed quite low and front on, and you can see that also by the fact that there just really isn't that much shadow under the nose either. That's also the fill, which we'll get to in a second, but I think this beauty dish is quite low, maybe just above the lens of the camera itself. So we're going to start with assuming we have a beauty dish overhead. And it is overhead because we can tell by the catch light that this catch light is slightly on the right of the eye, this one is slightly on the left of the eye, so we know we're looking right above. So this is our key light, a quite specular harsh beauty dish from overhead, lighting from the top. Then we obviously have a fill underneath the chin. Again, if you look at the catch light in the eyes, you can see a double catch light, top and bottom. The strong one overhead is the beauty dish, and the softer, rounder one at the bottom is our fill from the bottom. And I'm going to guess in this case that it was probably a large silver reflector underneath. The reason it's a circular catch light and not something that's huge and oval is probably because this was silver, so it's catching the light quite directly, and that means that what we're getting is that beauty dish reflection in this light here. Even though it's probably a large silver reflector, it's quite a specular fill from the bottom. And they call this clamshell lighting because if you imagine you've got your head here and you've got your beauty dish overhead, which is lighting from the top, and then you've got your reflector underneath, which is bouncing light from this dish back in underneath. You can see that this is sort of creating a clamshell effect with this clam in the middle. That's why they call this clamshell lighting. Then let's take a look at the background, which is a very evenly lit white background. And we know that that is not our key light, because if it was just the beauty dish lighting this on a white wall behind, it wouldn't be this even. It would be hotter down the bottom because it's facing downwards, and there'd be some vignetted, shaded, sort of darker corners around. But it's very, very evenly lit. So either this is a white wall which has been evenly lit with multiple lights behind, which I'm going to guess is not the case in this case, or it could have been edited to look more even in post. I'm going to guess that's probably not true either, although that's possible. But what you could also do is put a very large light source behind, either a very big octa or a scrim, and light it from behind so that it's very, very evenly lit. And in my case, I think I'm going to go for that third option and put a very large light source behind and light it so it's nice and even. What you have to be aware of, though, in that case, and I'll show you this in the studio, is you cannot have that behind light, that backlight that's creating this nice even white background, too strong because it will start to flare. And you can see that all the hairs around are very crisp and very clean. If the light behind is too strong, it will start to flare and the outline of the portrait will start to look misty. And that's not what we're going for if we're trying to emulate the look of this portrait. So we have to control that backlight very, very carefully. Then I think the only other thing to pay attention to in terms of lighting is that there's still some very nice sculpted shadows on the sides of the face, if you look here. So that tells me that he either has the subject a long way away from any white walls, there's nothing white reflecting back in, that the light is coming strong from the top from the beauty dish, being bounced back in underneath, but he's maintaining the shadows on the side. And what I suspect he might have done is put in negative fill or black flags on both sides of the subject just off camera. And what that will do, if you place black material on either side, it's going to ensure that whilst the light is reflecting from the top and then being bounced back in from underneath, it's not being reflected in from left or right. So we still get some nice sculpted cheeks and the sides of the head, so we still maintain some of that shape. It's a top and bottom light, not a left and right fill. So we want some black negative space, negative flags in there that are making sure that our light is not spilling in from the sides. It's just a top and bottom light. In terms of the focal length for the lens, I'm going to guess that this was shot on around a 35mm because it does feel like a slightly wider angle. It feels like the photographer's quite close and there is a tiny bit of distortion in that the head is quite large in the frame in comparison to the shoulders. And then I think what I'm going to do is go between f2 and f2.8 in terms of my aperture, because you can see that the front of the face, the plane of the face, is all in clean, crisp focus from the tip of the nose right back to where the hair starts just in front of the ears. But as you get to the back of the head, you can see that the back hair here is starting to go out of focus. So I want that front plane all in crisp focus and the focus just to start to fall off towards the back of the head. So I'm guessing full frame f2 to 2.8 on a 35mm lens is where I'm going to try and shoot with this, because I think that will give me the look that O'Neill had. And I think that's enough for us to try a setup in the studio.
Okay, so we're here in my little garage studio, and let me show you, just flip you around and show you the setup that I've gone with. So what I've done is effectively create a little booth for my subject, and behind the subject we have this big octabox. That should give us a nice evenly lit white background. It won't cover everything in the frame, but it will cover the edges of my subject, and then I'm going to crop that in on post. But I just need to make sure that I have that nice clean outline. If I had a really massive octabox, I could just shoot it in camera, but I don't have anything quite big enough. On the sides here you can see that I've got black flags on both sides, so that it prevents that light or the light overhead from bouncing off the walls and filling in those shadows. I still want to sculpt out the cheeks. So this negative fill on each side is going to help me do that. My key light overhead, it is a Godox AD200 at 1/16 power through this Lencata beauty dish. Let me come around this side so you can see it from the point of view of the subject. So you can see it's overhead here. It's quite flat for a beauty dish, the angle, but I want to make sure I get a lot of that donut catch light in the top of the eye. The only compromise I've had to make here is I don't own a silver beauty dish. So I've had to go with a white beauty dish, which is going to give a slightly softer light, which is a shame, but you know, this is what I have to work with right now, but we'll see how close we can get. And then down below, I've got this silver reflector, which is going to give me that bounce light underneath the nose and the chin, and also that bottom catch light in the eye. So it's a big silver reflector, which is angled slightly upwards to help that light bounce back where I want it to be. This backlight is also an AD200, and this one is set to 1/64 power because I want this light really, really low. I don't want it too bright so that it flares into the lens or ruins the edges, those nice hard edges of my subject. So you can see that booth, overhead beauty dish, reflector underneath, big octabox at the back for my clean white background, and black flags on each side to sculpt out those cheeks. So when it comes to the camera, I'm on the Sony a7R4, which is a full frame with a 35mm prime on it for that slightly wider angle that I think he was shooting with, so that I can be a bit closer to the subject. It gives a bit more of that feel of intimacy he's got in his portrait as well. And you can clearly see why we call this clamshell lighting. Imagine this is the bottom shell here and the top shell of the clam at the top. The pearl in the middle is the head, and it gives that nice top-down lighting, bottom fill from the bottom. That gives us that double catch light, with obviously my big octa in the background to give us that nice even white light in the background. So I am on 1/125th of a second in terms of my shutter speed. F2 I've worked out is about the depth of field I want. And I put this right down to ISO 50 in this case because I really need to keep the light down. My overhead light is at 116 power, backlight is at 164 power, so a lot lower than the key light. I just need it to be enough to create that white background, but not so strong that it starts to flare into the lens. And let's take a test shot. And that looks pretty good to me. You can see that on there. You can see the blinking highlights that I've got set, which shows me that I've got that nice even white background behind, but it's not too strong that it's going to flare. Also to mention, I'm not on a tripod, I often would be, but in this case there's just no space, so I'm going to handhold so that I can stay close to this subject. I'm going to have that clean separation with the white from the background, but you can see there's a lot more going on in the frame. You can see the edges of that octabox. That's fine. We're going to have to crop anyway because I just don't have an octabox big enough for a 35mm, so the whole thing is full of white. But I think that's pretty good. Let me just show you why it's really important to keep that backlight lower and not to let it go too high. So I'm going to take this backlight up to the same power as the beauty dish above, so also 1/16 at the back. And you'll see what happens when it's too strong. I'll take a test shot. And now you can see that I'm losing the edges of my subject. It's starting to go misty in that background. I'm losing that nice defined edge, which you can imagine, this doesn't have any hair, but hair would just start to disappear if it was too strong, and you start to get those misty edges. That's why I take it right down to 1/64 I've worked out in this case. Gives me that very, very nice clean edge, so it's not going to ruin the hair of my subject. I'm going to have everything clean and crisp. The fall off from the plane of the face to the back of the head also looks like about the right depth of field. So I think with this setup now, we're ready to start shooting.
So we shot for about 10 minutes. We took maybe 30 to 40 photographs until we arrived at this one, which I think is pretty close to the spirit of the original photograph. And the only thing I did change while shooting is I turned this backlight down even more to lowest power, basically to 1/128 on the Godox AD200, because it was slightly too strong still. I mean, the outline was fine, but some of these fine blonde hairs I was still losing in that light, so it needed to go down to that lowest power to make sure I got this nice clean edge on all the hairs. So I think the first thing we need to do is to get a rough crop so we're close to that original photograph. So I pulled in the reference shot, and let's go Control T, and we'll change the opacity on this reference layer to around 50%. We'll drag this over the top here, Control T again, and let's just drag this so it's roughly lining up with our image, our reference image that we've created. So just lining up the eyes and the mouth roughly. That looks fairly close, maybe a little bit more, something like that. Fairly close there. Let's select that, and then we can pull this back up to 100%. Now, this original reference image, it looks square, but it actually is slightly off square. But I'm going to go for square just for the sake of a bit of symmetry. But you can also see that Alona's hair is slightly taller on the top, so it's going to have to be a slightly different crop to make sense for her rather than trying to copy the image underneath directly. So let's go to our crop tool, go to our ratio here and select 1:1, which is square. And let's just do something rough. Let's leave it too wide for now, and then we can tighten it up as we go. So something like that. I think it looks pretty good. And let's turn the reference shot off, and we can tighten this up now. So I'm going to go like this, just making sure that I've got equal distance within this inner third between the eyes, and I can come down a little bit, sort of framing most of the face in that middle third, but I don't want to get too close to the hair on the top. Something like that looks pretty good. So we've got that shot. We're slightly wider than that reference shot, but I think that works quite well. Now I'm going to apply a very, very light edit to this. Personally, I like a very naturalistic look to my portraits anyway, but the whole point with lighting like this beauty style of lighting, is it makes you look great right off the bat. You shouldn't need to do too much work. So I'm going to do a tiny bit of healing now, and I'm going to speed through this. If you want to know how I do healing, how I do a tiny bit of hair cleanup with flyaways or a little bit of skin cleanup, I've got a whole video on that on this channel. I'll link it down below, but I'm going to blast through this with a healing tool just for 2 minutes, just to clean up little things here and there, and then I'll check back in with you. Okay, so that's done. I've said it in other videos before. My general rule for skin retouching is I will take anything out on a face that won't be there in 2 weeks. I want to give you a really good skin day, but I'm not changing any of the features on your face or taking things out there that are permanent, because I think that's your character. It's part of your personality. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a little bit more edge contrast in this image. So I'm going to come down here to adjustment layers. I am going to select a black and white layer. And this is a formula I use for a lot of portraits. Everybody, no matter what your skin tone, no matter what your skin type or color, is some gradation of orange, which means that the shadows on your skin will hide in the reds and the highlights on your skin will be in the yellow channel. So if I bring down my reds, you see it starts to bring in that sculpting on the side that we created with that negative fill. And if I push up my yellows, it should bring up this T-zone here where the light is hitting the most. So creating a little bit of contrast in the skin, something like that looks pretty good to me. And then I'm going to change the blending mode of that channel to soft light. It's too strong, that effect, obviously. So all we do is come here to opacity, bring it down to 0, and then we're going to dial it up until we like the amount of contrast in there, and I think something about 24-25% looks pretty good to me. Next, we're going to work on the eyes, because those are the features of this sort of image. We identified it right up front that we wanted that double catch light in the eye, which we got. You can see the nice donut shape of the beauty dish in the top, which we got really nicely. We've got that reflection, that round reflection underneath, that's softer than that top light, but still there as that beauty dish bounces off the silver reflector. So we've got that exactly where we want it. But let's just get rid of this panel here. Let's pop this iris just a little bit more. So if we come here and we change to, or we add a curves adjustment layer above, we change the blending mode of our curves adjustment layer to screen, hit enter, and then I'm going to go command on a Mac or control on a PC and I. And that's going to invert that layer, turn it to black, and get rid of that effect. I'm going to take my brush, change my flow up the top here to 3%, which is going to mean we can paint this in, and change my foreground color to white. So we've got a white brush on a black mask now, so we're going to reveal the effect we put on underneath. Let's zoom in a little bit closer. And all I'm going to do is come here and just pop some of this color on the bottom here. I'm just painting in this effect. I'll show you what I've done. Again, this is one of those effects, I've said it in the video on eye editing, which you really need to be careful with, because you make people look like strange cat people or something if you use this effect too strongly. But something like that I think we can get away with. Let's turn that off and on. See how it's just popped that color at the bottom. And I think we can get away with this, especially because we did have that specular silver reflector underneath. So this kind of extra pop of light makes sense. Might just dial it down to 75% on opacity. So if I turn that off and on. Something interesting I noticed when actually taking this portrait and having a look at it close is how small the pupils on Michelle Pfeiffer are compared to Alona's pupils here, which are quite big. So what I realized, let me turn the reference image on so I can show you. Can you see how small the pupils are on Michelle's compared to Alona's, which are larger? I think what's probably happened is, or what could have happened, I don't know how the original image was taken, is that the Michelle Pfeiffer image was taken maybe with constant lights, so that actually her pupils were closing down to shut some of that light out, whereas I was using strobe, which means Alona's eyes were opening out, the pupils were opening out, and the flash fired, but the pupils didn't react in time to close them down. I still like this look, I think it's great, but it was just something interesting I noticed while taking a closer look at these images. So if you want those tighter pupils, constant light might be a way to go, but I kind of like this. I think it's a very nice kind of open look. Then I think to finish off, I'm just going to do a little bit of shaping with dodge and burn. So I'm going to come down here to my curves layer again, add a curves layer at the top, and I'm going to go to screen. And this is going to be my dodge layer. Again, I've got videos on all this stuff if you want to see it in detail. But all I'm going to do is accentuate the light I've already created. I'm not changing the lighting. I'm not adding to the lighting. I'm just bringing out the lighting that already exists. So we know that our beauty dish was over the top here. So all I'm going to do is paint in on this T-zone where that light would be falling, down the bridge of the nose here, and on these cheeks here, just sort of a little kind of triangle shape here, and then just this lip at the bottom, and then come in here and just this little line on the lip as well, and the bottom of the chin too. That should accentuate, and maybe just on these brows a little bit here, that should accentuate where the light was already hitting. If I turn this off and on, you can see it's just popping where that light was already there. I'm going to take this down a touch to make it a little bit more subtle. 73% looks pretty good to me. And then I'm going to do the opposite for the shadows. So I'm going to create another curves layer. This time I'm going to change the curves layer to multiply blending mode, which is going to help me deepen my shadows. Hit enter, Control or Command I to turn that mask to black, and then paint in with a white brush, soft white brush. I'm going to accentuate, just darkening down the sides, the cheeks here, where that shadow was that we already worked hard to create with the lighting. Maybe a touch under the nose, although we did want that light bouncing back underneath, and then some under the brow here. So let's turn that off and on. You can see how we just sculpted those cheeks in a little bit with the shadow that we created. And let's do one more layer above, another curves layer, and change this one to screen as well. Enter, Control or Command I to invert that mask, and we're going to come up to the hair here. And because I love some of this blonde in the hair, I just want to accentuate it a little bit. So I'm going to paint in, just masking in some of this this screen curves layer, just to basically dodge up those highlights in the hair and make them pop even more. And I think something like that looks pretty good. I just think it's a nice feature. If there's a nice feature like this, I just want to bring it out extra, the shine on that hair. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's turn that off so you can see, off and on, just to pop that at the top a little bit. And honestly, I don't think I do much more to this image. I really like how clean and classical this looks, and I think we got pretty close to that original. Let's turn on our reference layer above just so we can see. So there's the original shot that we were trying to emulate, and I think we are pretty close. Catch light's good, lighting looks very similar. There is an interesting color difference, but I'm not sure how much of that I want to emulate because I'm pretty sure this was shot on film. So there's a much warmer cast to this one, and maybe even a slight greeniness to the skin that I don't really want to see in my image. But what I might do is let's just come underneath here and go adjustment layer, color balance. And with our midtone selected, again, this is just pushing different colors into shadows, midtones, or highlights. With our midtone selected, let's just add -3 yellow here. And just for the sake of trying to get closer, let's just add 1 on the greens here. Something like that. And let's do the same for our highlights as well. So select the highlights. And again, -3 to put a bit of yellow in there. And for, let's try 2 on those highlights, something like that. I don't think I'd want to go more than that, to be honest. That's pretty close to sort of put it closer in terms of color space to the original, but I like the colors I've got going on here. And I'm not unhappy with that. I think we got pretty close to the original with this image. The look is right, the lighting is the right angle, we've sculpted those cheeks nicely, and we've got pretty close to the feel of what O'Neill did with Michelle Pfeiffer.
So I hope you found this video interesting and helpful, and that you picked up some tips, whether it's to do with learning how to recognize the lighting you're seeing in images, to building your own lighting, or even some of the editing techniques I've shown you today. And if you are enjoying this sort of video, please let me know in the comments down below, and maybe even give me some suggestions of famous portraits you'd like to see me try and replicate. But I hope the biggest takeaway from this video is to try something new, because you will learn a lot. Like I said at the start, this is not my style of lighting at all. I prefer a more side-lit, Rembrandt dramatic style. But learning and trying out this beauty style by emulating other photographers teaches me a lot about lighting control and position and that harsher specular fill and what it actually does. Trying a new technique will always teach you something new and will give you a new tool in your photographer's toolbox. Before I go, I want to say thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. The biggest selling point with Squarespace when it came to me was I really wanted something that was crisp, clean, and minimal. I don't like design that feels too cluttered and that takes attention away from the images I'm actually posting on the website. But Squarespace has a whole host of really well-designed minimalist templates put together by professional designers that are super easy to use. I can just click and drag in text blocks and photographs and videos and lay everything out, and it's in such a clean space that my work is the thing that ends up doing the talking.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.